Nick Ferrari at breakfast on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
7:48 the time. Let's pick up a little bit more detail of that story we're looking at just before the headlines. The government scaling back support for businesses with energy bills after warning the current level of help would be too expensive. To discuss further, Business Secretary Grant Shapps joins me now. And I note that yesterday your colleague, Chancellor Jeremy Hunt, said yesterday this won't cut inflation. This will push prices up in many cases. This is to try and counter inflation. But surely if the companies have to put up their prices as a result of this, that's not going to counter inflation, Mr. Shapps, is it? Good morning.
Yeah, morning, Nick. Look, I think it's fair to acknowledge that when you do anything, make any of these policy decisions, you're always balancing an array of often quite difficult choices. In this case, more borrowing and more tax against supporting businesses. And what the Chancellor's tried to do is balance both of those things. You've got,
but it won't stop inflation, will it?
Well, nor would, of course, banging up interest rates.
Indeed, but why would he put forward
and then
a false
costing
premise?
people more in their business loans? Well, because as I say, there's been £18 billion of support so far for businesses. We've actually got wholesale energy prices are back down below where they were before Putin illegally invaded Ukraine. So we won't be giving support at that stage. But nonetheless, the Chancellor's come forward and said, look, I understand there'll still be difficulties. This isn't until April, but I understand there's still likely to be difficulties. And therefore, here's up to another £5.5 billion to provide cover, even when, prior, when the wholesale gas prices were this low, there was no support at all. So, this is a balance. And I get your point about, well, will it or won't it lower inflation? The main thing to lower inflation is to make sure interest rates come down. Right. The main way to make interest rates come down is to satisfy the marketplace that Britain is a good place to invest. And so this is all connected, yes.
But you do see the link that many businesses will need to recoup their higher energy costs, so will put out prices, so that will not tackle inflation. You do see the link that I'm exploring.
Right, but you'll see the link the other way, which is if you borrow that money, inflationary pressures will have to be dealt with through higher interest rates, and higher interest rates for businesses means higher borrowing costs, and for homes it means higher mortgage rates. So these are the balances that governments have to come across, aren't they?
At least, Secretary of State, the cap gave businesses a degree of certainty. They won't have that, which is what they had before. Some will possibly now go bust, won't they?
Well, I very much hope that isn't the case. And actually, if that were the case, then you'd be making the same argument about gas prices prior to Putin's invasion, because, as I say, we've seen a big decline in the wholesale gas price. One thing that both the Chancellor and I are very interested in is, given that the wholesale gas price has fallen so much, when and why haven't we seen all of that come through to the actual prices that businesses are paying for their energy supplies? Now, that is partly just a question of timing, because these things take a while to feed through to the system. But actually, if there's anything else going on, we want to know about it, and we've both written to Ofgem to ask them to investigate exactly that. But this is ongoing support, and I should just say, in the case of businesses, there is other support as well. Business rates, for example, that's a £13.6 billion package for pubs. The alcohol duty frees. These things are all designed to try and help. And I'm not pretending it's easy at all. What I am saying is a responsible government has to make those difficult choices between, do you put up tax, do you run the risk of higher mortgage rates and loan rates for businesses? We saw what happened with that before. Or do you kind of ease back to a normal situation where governments don't normally intervene and support energy bills? Of course, this is a very unusual situation caused by Putin.
Okay. Another very unusual situation is we're looking at more strike by ambulance crews tomorrow. We've had nurses' strikes already, and it is reported that during talks, one union saying the Health Secretary, Steve Barclay, suggested NHS staff such as nurses need to work harder. Do you think our staff in the NHS work hard enough? What would you say to Mr. Barclay had he said that?
Yeah, well, hold on. First of all, without wishing to sort of get involved in a one-sided description of the conversation, but I would say nurses work incredibly hard, and actually because They are working incredibly hard and been under so much pressure through COVID. Nurses, indeed NHS workers, were the only part of the public service who got a pay rise last year when all the pay was being frozen through COVID in recognition of that. But I think what we do want to see, and this is why these discussions have been taking place, these talks, is some of these strikes, some of which have been going on a very long time, brought to a close. And we think it's important that we don't have strikes which go on forever, and indeed strikes which don't contain minimum safety levels, so that people's health is looked after as well. So those are the things we're really trying to achieve here.
What have you achieved, not you personally, but the Conservatives, 13 years stewardship of the NHS? As it's revealed today, patients will be treated in temporary cabins set up in hospital car parks. That's great work by the Conservatives of the NHS, isn't it? We're now going to be treated in a porter cabin.
Well, I think the most important thing is to deal with these backlogs and the pressures that the NHS are under. And I was on your programme for 2.5 years talking about COVID. I don't think it's a huge mystery why it is that the NHS now finds itself under exceptional pressure. We know that more money's been going into the NHS than ever before. We know people are working incredibly hard. But the fact that people couldn't be diagnosed and some cases weren't coming forward because of the restrictions during COVID has put unprecedented pressure on now. So I'm in favour of the NHS doing whatever it needs to do to clear those backlogs, and if that means temporary modular whatever, then or using clinics closer to people or whatever else is required. I mean, for heaven's sake, let's get on and do those things. But anyone looking at this realises that through COVID, the NHS built up enormous pressures. It was dealing with one thing primarily, COVID, and having now to go back to all that elective surgery that didn't happen is putting huge pressure on.
Another area where there is industrial unrest, sadly, is the rail unions, as you'll be aware. You, of course, were a long-serving Transport Secretary. Last month, Mick Lynch, the General Secretary of the RMT, said, and I quote, "I think Grant Shapps has still got his hand in it, the discussions over the rail dispute." Has your advice or counsel been sought by Mr. Harper, or are you still in any way involved in the rail dispute, as Mr. Lynch asserts?
No, it was really curious. He kept saying this throughout the whole period, even when I was on the back benches, that I was somehow controlling things behind the scenes. And I can confirm I've not had a single conversation with the following two transport secretaries about the way that they handled the strikes. I do appear to some extent to have been living rent-free in Mick Lynch's head for all that time, but I can promise him it's nothing to do with me at all.
Coming back to the health dispute, there's a suggestion a payment of £1,000 for each health worker could break the deadlock. Is that something under active consideration by the government?
Well, I'm not. I should say I'm not in those talks, so I don't know the exact conversations. I do know that because people, I think, listening to this discussion about strikes and other discussions might have come to the conclusion the government had somehow just come to a figure, offered it, and that's been rejected by the unions. That's not what's happened. Both sides have put their evidence to the independent pay review bodies. The independent pay review bodies have taken all the circumstances, including the projected inflation, the high inflation we saw, into account and then made their recommendations. The government has fully accepted their recommendations. So that has been, on the government side, our position. We haven't quibbled with it. We haven't told the independent pay review bodies that we couldn't afford it and we're not going to pay that much. We've accepted it. Now, if the unions have a different view, we're very interested to hear what that view is. And that means that we think it's worth having those discussions, having those talks. Quite where they'll lead, I don't know, and I'm not in the discussion, so I can't provide you much guidance on that.
Last minute or so together, you'll be aware that the teaching unions are currently balloting about possible industrial action. The National Education Union closes on Friday, the NSUWT. What look would it be for the Conservative government if we had the rail staff, the nurses and the teachers all on strike? You're not really competent in handling this country, are you? Not you personally, the government, is it?
Well, look, I think it's a reflection of the fact that
you're hated, that the Conservatives are hated, basically.
Well, hold on, Nick. This is below you. Every Western country is experiencing
I'm older than you,
huge
and I go
pressures.
back some years to see this level of industrial. And if you don't like the word, the level of opprobrium then directed towards your government.
Well, look, often the unions, and of course the opposition, Labour, who are paid by the unions £120 million since 2010, will take this approach. But what I would say is just have a look. Let me finish answering your point. Look what's happening across the world right now, where inflation has spiked at levels we haven't seen for decades. Why has that happened? Very simple. Putin illegally invaded Ukraine, pushed up energy prices, pushed up inflation, and interest rates have gone up. Now, not surprisingly, people working in the public sector then go, hold on a minute.
The geography teacher deciding to go on strike is not the cause caused by Vladimir Putin.
Yes, no, of course.
You and I have known each other long enough. Come on.
Of course.
This is an extraordinary breakdown
I'm surprised.
in industrial relations between the Conservatives and the Union. You have to go back to the days of Mrs. Thatcher for this level of animos.
People are striking, and actually the teacher unions have said the same, because they say, rightly, that inflation is very high and the cost of living is therefore too high. Why is inflation that high? Very simple. Putin invaded Ukraine illegally. We are paying the costs of war. And as I often say, and I comment to the Ukrainians who live in my house, for them, they're fighting on the front line. Not for them because they're out the country, but for their families. They're fighting on the front lines. For us, freedom isn't free. And there's a cost. And the cost is that we have had to pay very high inflation. And that has led through to every sector of the economy and all the public services. And what a responsible government has to do is balance those perfectly proper demands for higher pay with the tax that we would have to raise from all your listeners in order to pay it. So, that is the balance, and it is where it's come from.
Finally, and credit to you, you are one of those who've put your money where your mouth is. You have brought Ukrainians into your home, and credit to you for that. Might I ask you, as it is suggested, Britain will lead the way across the world by sending tanks, Challenger tanks, to Ukraine to obviously move the conflict, to move the fight. But what do you imagine the reaction of the Ukrainians living with you might be?
Well, we've been, I speak to them about this a lot. We've been, as a country,
just remind me,
generous.
Is it two you have? Sorry, Mr. Shapps, I've forgotten. Is it
Three and their dog.
300
Three
dog.
generations and their dog.
Right.
Their dog. But what I was going to say
that's right, because
that,
you have a cat, didn't you? It was a strange arrival.
We have two cats.
Yeah,
we have two cats.
And they haven't made a bolt for the blue. They've not.
They did leave home for the first 6 months, but they've returned in the last couple of months. So it's just nice. They seem to be less scared of the Ukrainian dog. But what I was going to say was that they make it very clear that the Britain's support for the Ukrainians has been exceptional, and that's happened both at a national level with people taking him in families, but also with the kind of equipment that we've been providing. We provided these NLAWs. These are anti-tank missiles. We didn't wait for the war to start. In advance, a couple of thousand of them in advance, and then many thousands during the war, and much else besides. I speak to my opposite number pretty regularly, and they clearly think that the UK leads the way. Now, I know that tanks are one ask. We've provided a couple of hundred armoured vehicles during this battle, and obviously we will have some equipment which is more readily available, like the anti-tank weapons, which have been phenomenally successful to provide to the Ukrainians. But our support is completely undiminished. And one thing I can tell you is we'll provide at least as much support for them this year as we did last year.
Grateful for your time as ever. Thank you. Transport Secretary Grant Shapps appearing here on LBC 1 minute after 8. Before we go to the news headlines, let's do a quick update. I understand people are now possibly going and availing themselves of the chance to buy that book. LBC's Rachel Venables explains. Rachel.
Nick, the doors to Waterstones